Traveling through Fremont County, you might drive past green fields of alfalfa or rows of sugar beets and not think much of them. But every one of those fields is a reminder of the generations who worked to bring water to the desert. As Molly Hoopen-Garner, local researcher and writer, explains in her 1991 book, To Make the Desert Bloom, how irrigation came to the ceded portion of the Wind River Indian Reservation, greening the desert, making it bloom, was a dream shared by many during the last half of the 19th century. By the end of the century, it had become almost an obsession. Welcome to the Rediscover the Winds podcast, a podcast by the Fremont County Museums. With museums in Du Bois, Riverton, and Lander, the Fremont County Museum System is committed to collecting, preserving, and interpreting the stories of Fremont County and the Wind River area. The unique artifacts found at our museums relate the history of central Wyoming with information which, in many cases, can't be found anywhere else. With the Rediscover the Winds podcast, we hope to bring some of that history to you, wherever you are listening. Last episode, we talked about the history of the town of Hudson. We explored how the coal mining industry created a thriving town and community. We looked at the kinds of businesses Hudson had, as well as how the mines drew people from all over, creating mining camps that were melting pots of nationalities. This episode, we're turning our attention to one of the most transformative forces in our region's past, irrigation. Because without it, there wouldn't be farms, fields, or many of the communities we call home today in Fremont County. Before canals and reservoirs, Fremont County was high desert, sagebrush as far as the eye could see, but there was life here, a life shaped by water. The Wind River and its many tributaries sustained buffalo herds, native plants, and indigenous communities for centuries. For the Eastern Shoshone, the rivers weren't about big farms. They were about survival, movement, and tradition. But in the late 1800s, everything changed. The U.S. government wanted to settle the West, and Wyoming, including the area now known as Fremont County, was in its sights. There was one big obstacle: water. Without irrigation, the land was too dry to farm. But if you could control the rivers, you could make the desert bloom. Early settlers didn't ask for permission. Starting in the 1860s, they dug ditches and took as much water as they wanted. But as the cattle industry boomed in the 1870s, water demand skyrocketed. Ranches popped up along every creek and river. Private ditches crisscrossed the land. Chaos threatened. So in 1875, Wyoming's territorial legislature passed its first irrigation law. It created the role of water commissioner, someone with the power to divide up water when there wasn't enough to go around. The roots of Wyoming's modern water law were planted. But even these early laws weren't enough. Congress knew the West couldn't be settled without serious irrigation. So in 1877, they passed the Desert Land Act. It was supposed to turn dry lands into farmland, but the requirements were brutal. Build ditches, irrigate, prove you spent money improving the land, all within 3 years. Most settlers couldn't pull it off. Of nearly 15,000 claims, fewer than 5,000 got final patents. Clearly, individual farmers couldn't do it alone. The West needed massive irrigation projects and money to build them. Enter the Carey Act of 1894. This was Congress's big plan to finally make irrigation work in the West. Wyoming Senator Joseph M. Carey, backed by the cattle industry, pushed it hard. The idea was simple. The federal government would give each western state up to 1 million acres of land, but only if the states promised to irrigate it. Sounds like a good deal, right? In return, states had to reclaim the land and sell it to settlers in 160-acre chunks. But there was a catch. No one could buy the land unless they bought water rights from an irrigation company. And before they got a patent, they had to prove they'd irrigate at least 1/8 of their plot. Wyoming jumped on the opportunity. In 1895, the state appointed the state engineer and board of land commissioners to pick the land, manage it, and sell it. Almost immediately, developers lined up. The first Carey Act project in Wyoming? The Cody Canal, filed by the Shoshone Irrigation Company. Soon, other projects popped up in the Bighorn Basin and along the Laramie River. But there was a problem. Actually, there were lots of problems. For one, the costs were badly underestimated. Building canals and reservoirs in Wyoming's rugged landscape was way harder and far more expensive than the companies planned. Water supply was also overpromised. Settlers quickly realized they'd be paying a fortune for water rights they might not even get. As a result, many companies lost money and quit. Settlers weren't buying. Projects stalled out. By 1902, just 8 years after the Carey Act was passed, Wyoming had applied for over 450,000 acres, but had managed to actually patent barely 11,000. It was clear, if irrigation was going to work, Wyoming needed help. Big help. Enter the Reclamation Act of 1902. This was the federal government's way of saying, okay, we'll take it from here. The new U.S. Reclamation Service would plan, fund, and build the massive engineering projects the West needed. But there was a catch for the feds, too. They had to follow state water laws. In Wyoming, that meant getting permits from the state engineer like anyone else. Pretty soon, failing Carey Act projects were converted into federal reclamation projects. Money started flowing again, engineers got back to work. But even federal help couldn't change one basic fact about Wyoming. All of its water comes at the same time. Spring runoff from snowpack provided the bulk of the state's water, but farmers needed it in late summer, so Wyoming had to store it. In 1903, the legislature passed new laws laying out how to build reservoirs and regulate their use. The next decade saw a boom in reservoir construction, including the first Boysen Dam and reservoir near Shoshone in Fremont County. Meanwhile, irrigation on the Wind River Reservation was developing along a different path. The reservation was created in 1868 as a homeland for the eastern Shoshone. A few years later, the northern Arapaho were moved onto the reservation as well. From the start, irrigation here looked nothing like the big speculative projects popping up elsewhere. Small private ditches were built steadily to support native farms along the Little and Big Wind Rivers. The first of these was the Crooked Creek Ditch, dug in 1871. But it wasn't just about farming. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, or the General Allotment Act. It aimed to break up tribal lands and force native people to adopt individual land ownership. The idea was, in their words, to, quote, civilize native communities by making them farmers. In practice, it was a tool to open up reservation land to white settlers. Land was divided into individual parcels for tribal members. Anything left over was sold to homesteaders. On the Wind River Reservation, most of the new allotments and the small irrigation ditches that came with them ended up south of the Big Wind River. Only a handful were farther north, near Crowheart. By 1905, the U.S. Indian Service had filed for water rights for more than 80 of those small ditches with the Wyoming State Engineer's Office. But that same year brought a massive change. The U.S. government negotiated what became known as the Second McLaughlin Agreement. Under this deal, the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho tribes agreed to cede all the reservation land north of the Big Wind River and east of the Popoja River. In exchange, money and rations. But there was another clause. They gave up all rights to the water north of the Big Wind River, so it could be used to irrigate land for white settlers. Once the land was officially ceded, many thought settlement and irrigation would be easy, but nothing was ever simple. That same month, State Engineer Clarence Johnston started lining up bids from land development companies to build the canals and reservoirs. By August 1st, the contract was awarded. The winner? A group of Chicago investors who formed the Wyoming Central Irrigation Company. Serving as general manager of the company was Fenimore Chatterton. At the time, Chatterton was also Secretary of State, and from 1903 to 1905 was the acting governor of Wyoming. A Republican, Chatterton was naturally disliked by the Democrats, but was also not very popular in his own party. This was mostly due to his decision as governor not to commute the hanging of the infamous Pinkerton detective Tom Horn. It was Chatterton who initially approached salt magnate J. Morton and his associates with the proposition for the irrigation company. Claiming that there was 350,000 to 400,000 acres of land available for irrigation, he told Morton no less than 200,000 applications would be filed for these lands. He promised the system could be built for $1 to $1.2 million. To further sweeten the deal, he added the usual custom in Wyoming which was to sell water rights for 1/4 cash down and the balance in 10 annual payments. This meant the irrigation company would make a profit within its first year at $2.25 million, with the total profit of $10 million collected over the next 10 years. Chatterton and Morton's plan was big. They immediately filed for state water rights for over 330,000 acres. Everything looked ready for a grand opening when the land opened to settlement on August 15th. But when opening day finally arrived, reality didn't match the hype. Wyoming Central Irrigation Company had been promised a gold rush of settlers. Their big sales pitch predicted 200,000 filings for 160-acre farms. Investors expected to make a fortune selling water rights. Instead, just 10,583 registrations, and nearly all of them were packed into the brand new town site of Riverton. Very few bothered with the land further out where the company had planned its big canals. Worse yet, the settlers were angry. They balked at paying $30 an acre for water rights, a fortune for anyone just starting out. Local newspapers lit up with criticism, calling the company greedy and urging people to resist the prices. Still, the company tried to keep up appearances. They broke ground on the Riverton ditch in October 1906 and actually managed to deliver water the following spring. But the hoped-for flood of new filings never came. The company's cash flow was a disaster. Instead of the promised 1/4 down payments in the first year, they had to let settlers defer what little they paid just to get any contracts signed. By 1907, local farmers had had enough. They formed their own group, the Settlers Cooperative Irrigation Company, and announced plans to dig their own ditch, one that would parallel Wyoming Central's big canal plans, but offer water for a fraction of the cost. The state engineer's office got pulled into the fight. Settlers Co-op argued the state had no right to award permits to Wyoming Central in the first place, claiming the water should have been open for anyone to claim after the reservation lands officially opened. A showdown followed. The Board of Control held a special session in June 1907 and sided with Wyoming Central, upholding their water permits. The Settlers Co-op took the fight to district court, but lost there too in June 1908. Even so, Wyoming Central's troubles were far from over. Sure, they'd won their illegal battle, but victory in court didn't mean settlers were buying water. By 1908, the company was desperate. The vast majority of land under the Riverton ditch remained unsold. 13,000 of the original 15,000 acres hadn't been claimed. That's when J. Morton, the company's biggest investor, pushed back. He told state engineer Clarence Johnson, "Why should we start digging this giant main canal when we can't even sell the water we already have?" Morton was blunt. Unless the state or federal government forced settlers to buy water, he wasn't about to throw more money at the project. He even suggested maybe the state should get Congress to make the land eligible for the Carey Act so they could get federal help. Johnson hated that idea. He wanted the company to deliver on its promises. Instead of seeking federal aid, he came up with a threat. If you don't build, we'll hike the price you're allowed to charge settlers by $5 per acre for every year you delay. That amendment went into effect in December 1908. Under pressure, Wyoming Central did commission new surveys on the main canal, but the financial picture was still grim. In spring 1909, they tried to deflect attention by promising to rebuild the existing Riverton ditch, installing a new headgate, adding a concrete core wall, and building a 6-mile extension. But even that plan fell apart. 2 settlers refused to grant a free right-of-way across their claims, and the company used that as an excuse to halt work. Locals were furious. Newspapers accused the company of stalling while charging settlers too much for water that didn't even reach their fields reliably. Meanwhile, Morton learned another unpleasant truth. He discovered Johnson had failed to enforce the $5 per acre annual rate hike agreed to the previous year. So, in the summer of 1909, Wyoming Central and state officials sat down for tense negotiations. They signed another agreement, reconfirming the rate hike and giving the company even more time. This new deal bought Wyoming Central some breathing room. In exchange, the company didn't have to build anything new until they'd secure water contracts on at least 40% of the land they planned to irrigate. But that turned out to be wishful thinking. Johnson spent the rest of 1909 and 1910 trying to help the company sign up new settlers, but the numbers were dismal. By the start of 1910, it was clear. almost no one wanted to pay for Wyoming Central's expensive water. Johnson was running out of patience. By mid-1910, the company was failing to meet even its reduced promises. Settlers weren't buying water rights, construction on the main canal wasn't happening, and frustration was boiling over on all sides. Investors like J. Morton were demanding changes. Morton argued that the company had been sold a fantasy. Newer surveys conducted showed that instead of 294,000 irrigable acres, there might be only half that. Huge stretches between 5 Mile Creek and Muddy Creek were too sandy, too barren to be farmed effectively.
Morton wanted to renegotiate.
He didn't want to invest in a giant canal system for land that couldn't be sold. Johnston refused. He insisted his original estimates were right and threatened to cancel every permit the company held if construction didn't start immediately. Behind the scenes, Johnston scrambled for a backup plan. He started talking with another outfit, the Talmadge and Bunton Land Company, which had done other Carey Act projects in Wyoming.
He made a conditional deal with them to take over the project if Wyoming Central defaulted.
And then, in August 1910, Johnston lowered the boom. He canceled all of Wyoming Central's rights and contracts.
The announcement sent shockwaves through the community.
Johnston published an open letter in the Riverton Republican, telling settlers they didn't have to pay Wyoming Central for water anymore because the company had lost its rights. The company fired back immediately.
They claimed their permit for the Riverton ditch was still valid.
After all, it was completed and in use. Settlers who had bought water rights from them did have a legal claim. That dispute kicked off 6 years of legal wrangling between the company and the settlers along the Riverton ditch. Lawsuits and countersuits flew. Meanwhile, Johnston himself was burned out. In November 1910, he sent his resignation letter to the governor, effective February 1911. But even with Johnston out, the chaos wasn't over. Local newspapers at first cheered Wyoming Central's downfall. They eagerly reported that the Talmadge and Bunton Land Company was going to take over and finally get the canal built. But that hope evaporated just weeks later when Talmadge and Bunton backed out without explanation. Control of the failed Carey Act projects, including the Wyoming Central mess, was transferred from the state engineer's office to the Wyoming State Board of Land Commissioners. For the next 3 years, newspapers kept printing rumors of new investors and new surveys. Engineers came and went, but no one actually started digging again. The reality was clear. The main canal was dead in the water. But the settlers weren't about to give up on their land. By late 1913, it was obvious no big company was going to save them. The state couldn't find new investors. The grand Carey Act dream of private irrigation development had collapsed. So, the local farmers and ranchers took matters into their own hands. In June 1914, they formally organized the Riverton Ditch Company. Their plan was simple but bold. They would buy out the existing Riverton Ditch from Wyoming Central and run it themselves. The first board of directors reads like a who's who of Riverton pioneers. Jacob Dellfelder, a successful sheep rancher and businessman, led the charge. Serving with him were James Jewett, Roy Hayes, L.G. Fuller, and Ted Abra. Financing the new company was creative and risky. Each landowner was issued 20 shares of stock for every acre of land they owned under the ditch. And to make sure the company had collateral, every owner handed over a first mortgage on their land. It was a powerful show of local determination. If the state and big investors wouldn't make the desert bloom, they'd do it themselves, even if it meant betting the farm, literally. Meanwhile, other settlers were looking at how to get water to the higher lands above the Riverton ditch. Their solution? Extend an existing ditch built years earlier by the federal government to serve Indian allotments on the north side of the Big Wind River. This was the LeClaire Ditch, also known as the Edmo Ditch. The settlers formed a new plan to lengthen it and bring irrigation to their own homesteads. They chose one of their own, I.D. Woodward, an engineer, for the new project, named the LeClaire Riverton No. 2 Ditch. Construction was a community affair. The 20-mile-long ditch was divided into 7 sections, each assigned to a local contractor. These weren't outside companies, they were local landowners with teams and equipment. They built it themselves on their own timeline, determined to make their land productive. By May 1916, the extension was complete. It served about 11,500 acres of homesteaded land in addition to 1,200 acres of Indian allotments it had originally supplied. In just a few years, these farmers had gone from relying on a distant company in Chicago to running their own irrigation projects built with local labor and local know-how. But the story wasn't over. Even as settlers were building their own ditches and claiming their independence, the legal mess with Wyoming Central just kept getting uglier. By 1916, lawsuits were piling up against the company. Farmers who had bought water rights from Wyoming Central refused to keep paying them. Many claimed the ditch was so poorly maintained that it routinely leaked, flooding their crops instead of watering them. One lawsuit that made headlines was filed by Nina Laporte. She successfully sued the company after a leak in the canal destroyed her entire hay crop. Hers was just one of many court cases that revealed how broken the old company's promises had been. By now, Wyoming Central was financially underwater. It couldn't pay its debts, it couldn't maintain its ditches, and it certainly couldn't build anything new. Once again, the settlers had to take matters into their own hands. On October 25, 1916, they formally incorporated the Riverton Valley Irrigation Company. This new group was determined to take control of the Riverton ditch system and run it properly. Many of the local leaders from the Riverton Ditch Company were on the board here too. Jacob Delfelder and L.G. Fuller, along with James Graham and local attorneys Paris Stepp and Orion Gibson. Under the state's supervision, a deal was struck. The physical assets of the Wyoming Central Irrigation Company, including canals, laterals, rights-of-way, and maintenance equipment, were transferred to the new Riverton Valley Irrigation Company. But it wasn't a free gift. The settlers also had to assume some of the old company's debts, which they financed through bonds and assessments on their own land. On February 24, 1917, the Wyoming State Board of Land Commissioners granted the Riverton Valley Irrigation Company and the Riverton Ditch Company a preferential right to use the natural flow of the Wind River and its tributaries. For the first time in years, the local farmers felt like they had real control over their water and their future. A few years later, to improve efficiency and cut costs, the Riverton Ditch Company and the LeClaire Ditch combined forces. In June 1921, they were officially incorporated as the LeClaire Riverton Irrigation District. After more than a decade of legal fights, broken promises, and financial collapse, the settlers had finally wrestled their water system away from distant investors and made it their own. By early 1917, the settlers had gained control of the two existing canals in Fremont County. That was a huge win. But one big problem remained. The big main system, the Wyoming or Midvale Canal, still didn't exist. Without that main canal, hundreds of thousands of acres of potential farmland north of the Big Wind River stayed dry and empty. The dream of making the desert bloom was stalled. For years, the Wyoming State Board of Land Commissioners had been looking for any company willing to take on the massive project. No one was interested. Investors had been burned before and weren't keen to try again. Eventually, the state had to face the facts. The Carey Act experiment in Fremont County was a failure. The only real chance left was to hand the project over to the federal government and the Bureau of Reclamation. As early as 1916, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation had started allocating money from the Indian Appropriation Act to survey and study irrigation needs on the ceded portion of the reservation. These early investigations kept alive the hope that the big canal might one day be built. In 1919, optimism finally turned into action. On February 15th of that year, the newly elected State Board of Land Commissioners formally signed over to the federal government all of its rights and interests in the irrigation project. That included the water rights and reservoir permits once held by the Wyoming Central Irrigation Company, except for the Riverton Ditch, which had already been handed off to local settlers. With that deal signed, the Bureau of Reclamation took over. They called it the Riverton Project. By July 1919, survey crews and planners were in the field. They picked a spot for the project office in Riverton, first renting space at the back of the Farmers State Bank, and later moving to the second floor of the Masonic Temple downtown. They even built a dedicated warehouse along the railroad tracks in Riverton to stockpile supplies for construction. About 30 miles west of town, near the planned site of the Wind River Diversion Dam, the Bureau set up a full construction camp. This wasn't just a few tents. It was a small village with bunkhouses, offices, a store, an ice house, a machine shop, garages, cottages, and a water system with an 8,600-gallon concrete storage tank. They even installed 42 miles of telephone line to connect Riverton with the dam site via the town of Pavilion. But maybe the most thrilling sign of progress came in January 1920, when the Riverton Review newspaper excitedly announced, "First dirt on big U.S. project was thrown Monday, January 19th. That day, 2 giant drag lines shipped in from the Rio Grande project started carving out the new Wyoming Canal. One worked upstream, the other down, and for the first time in years, local residents saw real progress on their long-promised irrigation system. It had taken more than a decade of false starts, lawsuits, and heartbreak, but at last, the big canal was under construction. And that was just the beginning. Construction work on the diversion dam officially kicked off in July 1921. To start, workers had to reroute the mighty Wind River into a temporary canal, a massive engineering feat all on its own. Then, excavation began for the dam's headworks on August 21st. By May 1923, the dam was nearly finished, with only a 8-span steel bridge left to build. That bridge was handled by the Wyoming Highway Commission and would soon link the communities across the river. Around the same time, the team started work on the Pilot Butte Reservoir, which would become a critical water storage site for the project. But there was more than just construction going on in 1921. That year also saw the creation of the Mid-Val Irrigation District. On June 2, 1919, a mass meeting of landowners had been held in Riverton to discuss forming an irrigation district. A plan was presented by their legal counsel, Burr, and received overwhelming support. By October, over 60% of private landowners had signed a petition to form the district, which was sent to the Secretary of the Interior for approval since the federal government owned the public lands involved. However, a change in Wyoming law in January 1920 complicated things. The new law required a majority of landowners plus representation of at least 1/3 of the total land area to sign the petition. This meant gathering signatures was a slow and painstaking process, especially since many landowners lived out of state. Petition forms and explanatory letters had to be mailed to each one, encouraging them to support the district. By March 1, 1921, 146 landowners had signed the petition, representing just over 41% of the district's total acreage. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough.
On June 1, 1921, the District Court at Lander officially declared the Mid-Val Irrigation District organized.
M.S. Durrell, Earl Warren, and W.F. Brenneman were appointed as its first commissioners. With the district now in place, a governing body was ready to oversee the construction, maintenance, and management of the irrigation system. And finally, in 1925, the long-awaited moment arrived. Water first flowed through the Wyoming main canal, delivering irrigation to 1,600 acres west of Pilot Butte Reservoir. 1 year later, in 1926, the Bureau of Reclamation opened the first public land units under their authority. These ranged in size from 35 to 108 acres, and anyone qualified could file to claim them. To qualify, the applicants had to pass a review board, prove at least 2 years of farming experience, and have $2,000 in cash or equivalent livestock and equipment. Water and land rates were set affordably at $1 per acre for water, with additional water costing 50 cents per acre foot and land costing $1.50 per acre. Despite these efforts, initial uptake was slow. Only 19 farmers put water to use on 1,075 irrigated acres in the late 1920s. Lack of railroads, the rough terrain, and minimal capital among settlers made the project a tough sell. But the true test and the turning point was yet to come, with the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. The 1930s hit the American West hard. The Dust Bowl and the Great Depression drove desperate families out of places like South Dakota, Nebraska, and eastern Colorado. Many packed up their belongings and headed west, seeking new chances on the Wind River Reservation. For many newcomers, the Riverton project wasn't just a hopeful idea anymore. It was a lifeline. Yet, farming in Fremont County was no picnic. The first harvests were often meager. Many families ended up hoarding their crops, growing just enough for home use, with little left to sell. Money was tight. Local banks weren't eager to lend to farmers with little collateral or experience. But slowly, things began to turn around. The establishment of federal lending agencies like the Farm Home Administration in the mid to late 1930s brought much-needed credit to struggling farmers. With these resources, families could buy equipment, improve their land, and start producing crops at a sustainable level. The irrigation system, once a symbol of broken promises and failed projects, became the backbone of a small but resilient agricultural community. Over time, irrigation transformed Fremont County from a dry sagebrush desert into productive farmland, supporting dairy herds, feed crops, and livestock. Today, irrigation continues to define much of the county's agricultural economy. You'll find a patchwork of systems. Modern center pivot sprinklers spinning under Wyoming skies alongside century-old wooden headgates still doing their job. Each ditch and canal tells a story of people who believed in turning desert into farmland and making a home against the odds. From the earliest indigenous use of Wind River waters through the complex history of federal and local projects to today's sustainable tribal irrigation efforts, water remains the lifeblood of Fremont County. It's a story about resilience, community, and the unending quest to tame the wild and make it bloom. And that story, like the river itself, is still flowing. That's it for this season of the Rediscover the Winds podcast. Next month, we will begin our second season, which will focus on the theme of tourism and travel. Our first episode will focus on aviation in Riverton. Rediscover the Winds, a Wyoming history podcast, is brought to you in part by the Wind River Cultural Centers Foundation. The WRCCF is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping Fremont County museums preserve our Wyoming and Wind River cultural and natural history by directly supporting the efforts of the Du Bois Museum, the Pioneer Museum in Lander, and the Riverton Museum. To learn more, visit www.windriverccf.com and help us conserve our past while enriching our present. Thank you.